Time for the final position in our Pacers historic season rankings, looking at the best seasons by a center in Pacers franchise history. And boy, let me tell you, I think this was the hardest one. We'll dive into it today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today we are finishing up the last position on the Pacers best seasons at position history deep dive by looking at centers. A really, really fun group to look at because the Pacers have always had pretty good centers, but very rarely like tremendously great centers, whereas they, J.O., Reggie, Vic, Tyrese, like they've had really good players at pretty much every other spot, depending on Paul, obviously, Danny, Ron Artest. Like they have a stud center, and I think that the number one answer was pretty easy for me here. But everything else after that was like very thin margins in a way that was very tricky. I also have a lot of centers who've kind of etched their name in Pacers lore for Lifetime Achievement Awards, similar to Antonio Davis, where he was clearly very good for the Pacers the whole time he played there, but it was really hard for me to put Antonio Davis in the top five at his position. I have the same trouble with lots of centers, right? So what that team specifically needed from that five or what they were good at, or it was just really different to separate it. And that's where I think this one reminds me a lot of point guard in that, throughout Pacers history and really throughout history of the league, what you need from the 1 and the 5 is kind of more dependent on your team than some other positions, right? As a point guard, you had George Hill types who could really guard. You had Tyrese Haliburton types who could really pass. You had guys who could really shoot it, be really valuable for their teams. You had just pure setup men like Mark Jack. Like it was all different. And at a lot of other positions, two-way play was really valuable. And then at the 5, it is back to point guard where it's very different, where it's like you have guys who are awesome defenders that really impact the game that way. Even beyond Myles Turner, a very recent center, is going to make this list who did that for the Pacers. You have your scoring types who are going to make this list. You have your brute forcers. Like it all just matters in different ways. Rebounding and doing nothing else stands out a lot. And that's kind of how like up to the 90s centers really made their bread and butter. So this one was really varied and was really tough to dive into. And there's a lot of guys whose names need to be said who aren't in the mix for a top 5 spot to me. So if you're one of those people who likes just hanging out with your friends and shouting out random old sports team guys or even current sports team guys, this is about to be your favorite episode from this series. And again, thank you everybody who has much more old school Pacers knowledge than me. I would say post brawl, I can do pretty well and hold up, but I didn't watch the NBA at all before that. So I really appreciate the people who did watch or know that stuff much better than me who can chime in and help. So let's run through some dudes who were really good for the Pacers at the center spot, who had high peaks, but don't make the top 5 for me for various reasons. We start out with James Edwards, but many-time champion, very good center for many years in the pros, and was his baby parts of his career came primarily with the Pacers, very healthy, played a lot of games. And in 1981, specifically, is the season I would pick for him if I had to pick one for him. He averaged 15.6 points and 7 boards. He had seasons with better stats than that, although that was a good efficiency season for him. But he upped his passing significantly. That was his most assists per game in his career. His block rate went way up, even though he wasn't playing that much more. And primarily the reason I'm picking this is for the first time for the Pacers in the NBA, not including the NBA, they made the playoffs. And he was a starter and key player on that team. Very good player for the Pacers franchise. The second leading scorer on that team. Deserves a shout, but not among the top 5 best Pacers center seasons ever. Number 2, a guy that absolutely has to be mentioned that doesn't make the top 5 for me. Steve Stepanovic. Man, what could have been, right? Injuries really made this one not as fun because only a 5-year career. Now, to be fair, a little bit, I guess. If he doesn't get hurt, who knows if Rick Smits ever even gets drafted to the Pacers franchise. But Stipo was awesome. Sniffs double-doubles all the time. 12 to 13 points every game, 8 to 9 rebounds every game until he wasn't. He was very healthy. He played 79 or more games in all 5 of his seasons prior to being just done. He could have been awesome. Who knows what his career could have looked like, but hard to pick the perfect best season for him. I guess I would go with 1986-87, his second to last season. It wasn't his highest scoring season, but it was his best efficiency season, and was his top rebounds per game season with some other good stats like his steals reaching a career high and his turnovers reaching a career low and his blocks reaching a career high. I guess I'd pick that one. He did have some better scoring seasons, for example, and was routinely very good, though. But hard to pick out the best one. They only made the playoffs once with him, and he only played 4 postseason games in total. And guess what? It was 1986-87. So Stippo deserves that and gets that one. Herb Williams, another good one from that same team, same era of Pacers hoops. Again, it's hard to figure out who the actual center was for those, between those two and on those teams. But Herb Williams, also very good on those squads. 20-9, very good in 1985-86. Wasn't with the Pacers for super long, just over 7 years. And it's pretty long. I guess in the modern NBA, that would be considered an extremely long time. But if you sniff 20-10, maybe I should be giving more credit to this than I am. Very good player, very good seasons. Does not quite make the top 5 for me here. Next, and certainly not least on the doesn't make the top 5, but absolutely has to be mentioned, Lifetime Achievement Award guy number 1 we're going to mention today, Mr. Jeff Foster. Look, Jeff, if you watch Jeff Foster, you know he never was a top 5 center season for the Pacers, right? He just wasn't. But he was awesome for a long time. And this is where it's like, what you're going to tell me, if you don't know who Jeff Foster is, if you're listening to this, right? He was drafted in the 90s and was with the Pacers until 2012, right? Like, he played in the NBA for a long time. It was all with the Pacers, right? First round pick, gets traded straight away to Indiana and really ascends with the franchise. And it was just rock solid for forever. A good effort guy, 9 boards a game at his peak, good scoring at his peak. Didn't really mess up ever, like never turned it over. Wasn't a high foul guy. It was really hard for me to pick his best season for the purposes of this exercise. 03-04 was my first instinct when he was starting next to J.O. That year, and J.O.'s best year, ironically. That wasn't his best scoring season or his best rebounding season, but his best steal season. He was a low turnover guy that year. That was his career high. His second best season in terms of efficiency. And in the postseason, he led the entire NBA in 2-point percentage and still held up his stats as a starter in the playoffs for a team that almost made the finals. That was a separator to me because that was by far his best playoffs. The following year, he played 13 games in the playoffs and had worse stats and worse efficiency. Slightly similar efficiency, I think, would be a more adequate way to put it. But his regular season wasn't quite as good, I would say. He had some other good statistical seasons, but I think Jeff Foster's peak was 03-04. Then we get into this tricky morass of guys that this one might make a lot of people mad. I think this position is going to make people the most mad. 07-08 or 03-04 gets the Jeff Foster Lifetime Achievement Award. I think the top 4 seasons for me for Pacers at center, I could figure out, like, okay, these are clearly my top 4 in some order. The 5th spot was probably the hardest, like, nitpick, break a tie of anything I had to pick. Right? Like J.O.'s top season, what was it? Was pretty hard. Reggie's top season, what was that? Is pretty hard. Like deciding between David West and Detlef Schrempf was pretty hard. Okay, like that was all tricky, but reasonable, and they were all in the top 5. This is to get on the list for me. So here are my contenders for the 5th spot. That doesn't mean these guys aren't on the top 5 in a different season. But here are my contenders for 5th place for the Pacers ever at the center spot. Roy Hibbert in 2011-2012, his first All-Star season with the Pacers. That was his career high in scoring. That was his career high in rebounding, 2 blocks a game, but didn't have the playoff success that he had in future seasons. But clearly had a good regular season, right? And was a good player and had not reached he's on the ground all the time yet stage of his career, but wasn't also like at the defensive dominance of like, oh my God, Roy Hibbert is shutting down teams by himself. Yeah, although he was pretty close that year. Brad Miller in 2002-03, his only full season with the Pacers franchise, an all-star, right? The forgotten Pacers all-star. Every time people join the Pacers space and want to talk about the Pacers, learn about the Pacers, they go back and look at all-star history and they're like, I've heard all these names except for Brad Miller. You should know Brad Miller. He was an all-star with other teams too. His Pacers tenure was so short that I get why people don't know him, but good scorer, really solid in the post, good rebounder, but like a guy who shot under 50% from the field as a center who averaged 13 and 8. Like, you're going to tell me that guy was way better because he made an all-star team than some of the modern guys who weren't all-stars, right? It's hard for me to say just because he's an all-star, he should be on there. Like, I have Roy Hibbert was an all-star in the season I just talked about. Another contender for the spot for me is Rick Smits in 1997-98. I don't think this was Rick Smits' best regular season, but I do think a lot of stuff suggests that this should be the season that gets mentioned for him. That was his only all-star year in the league. He got MVP votes for the only time that year in the league. He averaged 16.7 points and 6.9 rebounds per game. And many, again, as I've said on the show many times, that I've talked to about the Pacers prior to my time knowing stuff, said that was the best team they've ever had, right? People say the same things. 2000 was their best season in terms of results. 2004 was their best chance to win the title. 1998 was the best team they ever had. I think discerning those is important. Rick Smits was very good for that 1997-98 team in the postseason. He was also very good in that season, right? 16.6 points, 5.3 rebounds, effective from the field. Very good player, right? Another all-star season. I'm cutting up between all-star seasons. My final contender for this spot was Myles Turner's best season to me in terms of his blend of offensive and defensive impact, which was 2018-19. Prior to this past season, that was the last time he played over 62 games in a season. He led the league in blocks per game. He was 5th in Defensive Player of the Year, so he certainly would have been on first-team all-defense now without positions involved in that process. One of the greatest thefts of his career is that he's never gotten one of those, and likely never will at this point. He probably would tell you, like, his season where he led the league in blocks, even though he didn't reach the games played criteria, because even if he didn't play for like 8 more games to reach the checklist, he still would have led the league in blocks, was remarkable. He finished 9th in Defensive Player of the Year last year. He's obviously a much better offensive player in the last 2 years with the Haliburton Carlisle teams, but not nearly as good of a defender. What season is the best for him, right? What season stacks up as his best? I think it's 18-19, and I would have said 22-23 is his second best season, but no accolades for that year. Just 5th in Defensive Player of the Year voting. So this was hard. Who should be the 5th center among those choices? If you're thinking hard about it, I bet the old heads will say, first of all, I didn't give Herb or Sipo enough love here, but they'd probably be screaming for Rick. Your age might determine who you pick. I will tell you who I pick and start the list going here in just a second. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Kids, they're always learning. They're always growing. As adults, sometimes we lose that curiosity. So what is something you'd like to learn? Gardening? A new language? Maybe how to finally beat your best friend in bowling. That's something I'm trying to learn. My friends are somehow good at bowling. Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder because your back to school era can come at any age. And therapy can also help with learning positive coping skills or learning how to set boundaries. It'll empower you to be the best version of yourself. It is not just for people who have experienced major trauma. So if you have been thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. So just fill out a brief questionnaire, get matched with a licensed therapist, switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. We're back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making this your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, hop on over to Locked On Nuggets. Jamal Murray's big extension came over the weekend. Whew, that's an interesting one given his whole summer timeline. But he was awesome in the playoffs 2 years ago. Certainly deserves it. Can Denver get back to where they were? I can't wait to see. Apologies to those watching or listening for one, yesterday's show timing. I was totally beat up coming back from travel over the weekend and couldn't get it out in time, but better late than never, I suppose. And I really wanted to talk about that stuff. So if you want to hear more about Kevin Pritchard's tenure running the Pacers, lots of deep dives on yesterday's show. And today, when I got back, my lamp broke in here. So you're getting different lighting on my face until I get a new one. So this iPhone light doesn't look as good, but it will do the best that I can possibly do right now. For now, let's keep going. Who should be 5th on this? The other trouble I had with this cutting up of this is proximity bias. Right? I talked about this with Tyrese Haliburton, where I know a lot and I've heard a lot about how good these older players were, and you have to take into account their era and what they were good at and their scoring and their accolades. But like the guy I've been around and have watched the most, like it's very easy for me to contextualize what their numbers mean in the context of the league. I don't know that at all for the other 3 guys, right? At all. So it's much harder. I guess I do know a little bit for Hibbert. And the trouble I have with Hibbert too is like, this is Hibbert's not his best season. So it's like, it's his second best season, fifth over. It's just hard. Right. And so proximity bias made me like, when I first looked at this, like, I'm like, am I really going to say that Brad Miller's all-star season was better than Myles Turner was in 18-19? No, probably not. But am I thinking that because I believe it? Or am I thinking that because I was around the Turner season the whole time? So I had a lot of trouble. Thinking about this. In the end, I think my ranking of the 4 seasons that I listed for you for the 5th spot would be Smits in 1997-98 as the best, Myles Turner in 18-19 as the second best, Roy Hibbert in 11-12 as the third best, and Brad Miller's all-star season in last. So my 5th center spot is going to Rick Smits in 1997-98, but it was hard. That one was really hard. I would like to hear what you guys think, or if I didn't give Herb or Stippo enough credit here, because they were clearly the 2 closest guys that didn't make it for me. And of course, some ABA Pacers should rocket to the top of this list if I included ABA seasons, which I should have already said. A lot of people comment on that. So let's rock from there. Rick Smits, 1997-98, reaches 5th place. And I also have Rick Smits in 4th place. I think his best season deserves its own spot. Very obvious to me when that was. His ascent in the mid-90s, where he went from pretty good to really good, is also kind of coinciding with the Pacers going from ascending team to like playoff deep runs all the time. 1994-95, Rick Smits' best season, just under 18 points a game. That was his best rebounding season by like a lot, by over 0.8 rebounds per game. Still decent passing. Turnovers went up a little bit that year as his role kind of ascended and he had the ball more and was asked to do more. But as his shots went up throughout the rest of his career, he still had trouble reaching that points per game number. He finished 9th in most improved player, was just generally very good. And then the playoffs came, and he was still great. He averaged over 20 points a game in the postseason that year for a Pacers team that reached the conference finals. That Magic series. Another one of those, man, the Pacers coulda, woulda, shoulda made the finals that year. Either way, over 20 points a game, 7 boards in the playoffs. I think that the postseason, that was his best playoffs. He had a better statistical postseason, but it was only in 4 games. I think 1985 was Rick Smits' best playoffs. I think 1998 was his best regular season, but I think he was barely better in the 98 regular season than he was in the 95 regular season. He was much better in the 95 playoffs than he was in the 98 playoffs. So I'm giving Rick Smits 1995 season as the Pacers' 4th best season by a center. His whole career was just really good. Big moments, the shot against Orlando, good in the playoffs on some of the best Pacers teams ever. Never played for another franchise. Like, I think that is the most fun player for fans to root for, is guys that they watch their whole career develop and grow and watch them overcome challenges and adapt to new teams and adapt to new roles, right? Fans love that stuff, especially when the team is good for a lot of that time, right? And so very likable player, very likable guy, stayed local after his career. Very easy to think back fondly of the Rick Smits days. His all-star season seems like the accolades should make that the best year, but I'm going with 94-95 as Rick Smits' best season with the Pacers. Top 3 now left. I think you're noticing a guy whose name I barely said, and that's Domantas Sabonis. Because on the center episode, or the power forward episode, I said, look, a lot of Sabonis' seasons, he started, air quotes, at the 4 next to Myles Turner. That's dumb. He was clearly a center. He played center on offense, but played power forward on defense. I'm calling that as a center. And then some of you, very correctly, I would add, pointed out that the Jeff Foster, Jermaine O'Neal dynamic was similar. In fact, J.O. played center a lot for those teams. So maybe I shouldn't have done it that way, and I should have maybe put J.O. here or put Sabonis to the 4. I did not have as much historical context with J.O., even though I watched a lot of J.O., like lots of full games of him, either growing up or on YouTube. So I apologize if you consider that an error. Either way, Sabonis I am putting in this episode. And his best 2 seasons with the Pacers are both in my top 3, but are not all of the top 3. For me, number 3 for the Pacers and the first Sabonis entry is 2019-2020 Domantas Sabonis. That was his first all-star season with the Pacers, right? He goes from most improved 13th place to most improved 6th place and getting 2nd and 6th man of the year to like, hey, this guy absolutely has to start now. It's time. Let's go. They lose Thad and they start him. And it worked. They were pretty good. They should have won 50 games that year, but the season was cut short and he missed the bubble, which who knows how much that actually changed their fortunes, as I talked about on yesterday's show, referring to Kevin Pritchard's past, but 18.5 points, 12.4 rebounds per game. Insane. He led the league 2 years ago with 12.3, right? That was crazy. He has always been a beast on the glass. That year, he really developed the passing kind of connection. And when they had McDermott on the team, there was just free assists every night. Wasn't turning it over a crazy amount, just a decent amount. Then and started to take some threes. He wasn't making them yet, but started to take them. Just a beast of a player. All-star that year for the first time. Really, it was ascending into a star and just a monster in his role. The best player on a team. Who saw that coming? It just never clicked with the health. He was always healthy. Nobody else in particular was, but very good season for him. Really started. That's when his career totally took off, but not his best season with the Pacers. And I have another season above this one at the center position. Let's get to the top two, including Sabonis' other season. Before we do that, though, we got to talk about the good folks over at FanDuel. You've heard us talk a ton about FanDuel on this very podcast because they're America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you because now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. What a deal that is. Again, you just bet $5, you get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon at a market game. How about that? All you need is a Google account, current form of payment. You can cancel anytime. $5 bet, 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket. Watch the Colts, watch whoever. To get that offer, just visit FanDuel.com. Download America's #1 sportsbook. That is FanDuel. We are back here on Locked On Pacers. Thank you for making us your first listen today and every single day. Your second listen has to be Locked On Colts. Hear about their season opener from over the weekend from Jake and Zach. What a game that was, although I'm sure most Colts fans don't like the result. It's a crazy streak. I know they had the tie in there, but not winning and opening that game for that long is pretty remarkable for a team that's like not been awesome, but has been pretty good that whole stretch. More on Locked On Colts because they're the indie team, man. Locked On Fever should exist, in my opinion. Either way, let's keep it rocking here, going through Pacers center seasons. You can probably guess the Sabonis seasons in the top two. I would like you to think right now what you think I have as season number 2. And I already talked about this player once, and I think this was his peak season and one of the most underrated seasons the Pacers have ever seen. And that is Roy Hibbert in 2012-13. Roy Hibbert, very good for the Pacers very frequently. At the end of his time, by the way, Roy Hibbert is still only 37. I find that to be impossible. But either way, Roy Hibbert, beast for the Pacers for a long time. 2013-14 was just a monster, right? All defensive second team, his second all-star, second in defensive player of the year. But 2012-13 to me was his best season. And that is just because of the playoffs. The regular season also matters a ton here. He finished 10th in defensive player of the year in the season I'm talking about. This is when he was really like on the map as like, oh, this guy alone is a top 5 defense. The Pacers were incredible on defense every year. Then, and this was before everything kind of started to fall apart and Hibbert started to be on the ground all the time. And this reminded me of Paul George a little bit, where it was like it's kind of the opposite, right? With Paul George, I think 13-14 was a very, very good season for him. I ranked it very highly on the best Pacers small forward seasons. In fact, I put it first, which was tricky because the vibes of that season were terrible, right? It was good at first, but then they ended terrible. The playoffs were like a struggle to get to the conference finals for a really good team. And the photo shoot and the trades, everything just was a disaster. So people remember that season poorly, even though it was kind of just as good as season before. With Hibbert, I kind of think it's the opposite, where the season the vibes were better. He was actually better, right? In 2012-13. That team, again, wasn't quite as good. They might have won 50 games if they had played all 82. They did win 56 the next year. Like, the team was just better. And yet I still feel like maybe I'm just over-indexing on that postseason where they were 1 game from the finals. But in 2012-13, Roy Hibbert finally proved like, oh, this guy's a stud defender. That was, before he stopped being a good rebounder. So 8.3 a game, 12 points a game. Efficient from the field. His efficiency dropped in 13-14, even though he made the playoffs. But in the postseason, again, this team was one game away from the NBA Finals against the Heat. Hibbert averaged 17 points and 9.9 rebounds per game. His highest efficiency, over 51%, in the playoffs that year, knocked in his free throws. He was awesome in that playoffs. That is a huge separator to me because even though he was better probably in some other regular seasons, like he was one of the best players in the whole NBA in that playoffs. If you combine the defensive and offensive impact, he was finishing around the basket. He was a threat. They turned him for over 12 shots a game. Who remembers Roy at that kind of level? He never hit 12 shots a game in the regular season, but he hit it in that playoffs. He was so good. So his regular season at 13-14 was probably better. And I already talked about 12-11 being, I think, his second best season. Maybe I should have 13-14 in there. That Pacers team was very good and made the conference finals, and he has some great accolades for it. And I think now that I'm talking, I probably should have talked more about Roy Hibbert in 13-14, but I think his best season, and also some advanced stats say his best season was 2012-13, and I am going to rank it very high because he was terrific that year, and the Pacers were terrific that year. That was his best impact defensively season. That was his second best season by win shares. This, to me, is the second best season by a Pacers center. Dominance on defense, very good on offense, exceptional in the playoffs, almost got the Pacers to the finals. Very good season for Roy Hibbert. Number one was very easy for me. Again, proximity bias played a factor here, but I mean, no one to this day could sniff what Sabonis did in terms of having to have the load he did offensively. Still, his to the time I'm talking right now, his only season over 20 points per game was 2020-21. That's the answer, by the way. Sabonis in 2020-21. Amazing score, right? Taking under 15 shots a game, over 20 points. 12 rebounds a game. Crazy, right? That's an exceptional number every season. 6.7 assists per game from a center. And people always talk, oh, they're just handoffs. Yeah, okay. If every center could go get 6.5 assists from handoffs every game, they would do it, right? It's not just easy to get assists from handoffs. Like it was a big threat because he could hit back cuts or throw it over the shoulder. Like he was actually a very good creator with the threats that he had. Best steal season for him still to this day. The turnovers were a concern for him, certainly, but to up to his 3-point percentage in a major way, that was the year he took the most threes per game of his career. That level of impact was massive. He made an all-star team. Once again, that Pacers team did not make the playoffs, unfortunately. In fact, we never got to see Sabonis as a starter in the playoffs for the Pacers. The year he could have and should have, he got hurt in the bubble, and then the next year they never made it back with him on the team. But by far, I think his best season, and to me, the best season by a Pacers center ever. I mean, I think people forget how good he truly was at that time. Like, he still is really good. Last year, Sabonis led the NBA in triple doubles and rebounds. The year before, he led the NBA in rebounds and had 14 triple doubles. Like, this is with the Kings, obviously, but like, that's a really dang good player. And with the Pacers in that best season, 24% usage, over 60% true shooting on that usage, with a 27.5% assist rate. That's like a guard number. And yet a beastly 18% rebound rate. It's almost 1 in 5 rebounds that came off the rim. He got, what a monster he was. The team was never fully optimized in his era for any player on the team, not just him. I'm not saying the Pacers failed him or even vice versa. That's just reality. But he was awesome. This will go down. Like, that team never amounted to much, so it's harder to compare it to some of the, Smits' teams making the conference finals, or Hibbert's teams making the conference finals, or now Turner has a season where his team made the conference finals. Lots of these guys had much better playoff runs than any Sabonis team did. But his regular seasons were so good and so far above what anyone else was capable of, especially in terms of volume and impact. I have to put him first, but I think this is the most feeble top spot of any position. I think this is more surmountable than Haliburton last year, Reggie Miller in 98, Paul George in 14, or Jermaine O'Neal's peak year. I think this is the one that could be overtaken the easiest, but probably not by the current team the Pacers have. What do you think about this one? I thought this one was the hardest, splitting hairs a lot of the way. It was really hard to poke through Roy because, again, like, people remember what his 13-14 was, I think, even though he still was an all-star and like had the accolades, it just didn't feel the same. Whereas Paul George kind of felt like the opposite. Myles, am I underrating him by leaning away from bias too much? Should I have had him fifth? Am I underrating Brad Miller or any of the guys from the early 80s? Should Rick Smits have been higher? What do you think? This one was truly the hardest, I think, for me to like split the hairs and get everybody in the order that I thought made the most sense. But Sabonis was just awesome. And maybe I should have had proximity bias thoughts about him too, but I just thought it was easy to say, yes, this is the best center the Pacers have ever seen for their franchise. Chime in because I need the historical context that people who can provide it have, because the next time I do this, the last episode next week will be actually picking the top 5 regardless of position. Going to be some Reggie, going to be some J.O. Who else deserves to sneak in there? We'll find out next week, and I will also find out next week because I'm not going to start that research yet. It's going to be really hard across positions to divide and conquer. This week's still coming. 2 episodes with guests that I have not reached out to yet. 1 episode by myself talking about what Pacers could win some awards. I want to talk about what it would take for the Pacers to win a championship from their current position with the current guys they have. So lots still to come here. We're getting very close to the season, so lots of good, important stuff to talk about. I'm sure we'll get like the GM survey soon. We've got a lot of news to actually talk about. Joe Mazzulla just said some interesting stuff about the Pacers. Just a lot to get to. So really looking forward to breaking that all down. Hope you guys enjoyed today's show. If you have anything you want to say about the rankings I have or think I missed something, hit me up at Tony R. East or comment down below on YouTube. Be back tomorrow talking more Pacers. Till then, everybody have a wonderful day.